Hi everyone, Ryan here with an After Effects tutorial where I'm going to show you how to create this stylized hand-drawn effect. Now these are all shape layers, and I've applied a couple effects onto them to give them this really cool hand-drawn look. And this is going to work really well on shape layers, it's also going to work on rubber hose rigs, and I'm going to show you some tricks to use it on text and some other cool stuff as well. As you can see, there's a lot of ways that you can stylize this and really push it in different directions, so I really hope you give this a try and see what cool stuff you can come up with. So, let's get started. Okay, so as you can see here, I've got a circle right here in the middle of the screen, and this is simply just a shape layer circle. So if we go into this effect, into this contents here, what I'm going to first do is go ahead and click Add, and I'm going to go Wiggle Paths. This is kind of what the whole effect is built around. So if I open up the Wiggle Paths here, I'm first going to change where it says corner here to smooth. You can see what this does is it just kind of smooths out those sharp corners. I like that look better. I think it makes it look more organic if you're going for a hand-drawn look. And you've got these two settings here, which is really going to give you a lot of control over this effect. So size, you can kind of think of like the amplitude or the intensity. You can see that's pushing the edges in and out. And the detail here, that's going to be how dense it is. So I like to set it to a low density for this effect, something like around maybe 5. And you'll see it just kind of makes these larger waves that it's pushing. That's going to look really good once we start overlaying this, as you'll see soon. Now for the size, I like to keep this fairly low as well, maybe something about 10, and we can always come back to it. Now, as you can see, this is automatically animated for us. If you press play, it just goes ahead and starts moving for us. So let's go ahead and add to this. I'm going to close up this Wiggle Paths and the ellipse. I'm going to rename this ellipse Main, and then I'm going to duplicate it. Now, as you can see, that's already added some thickness in some spots, and if I scrub through, you can see how that's looking. Now, what's happening here is that they both have a Wiggle Paths on that shape, but the Wiggle Paths, even though it's a duplicate, it's creating its own animation. So the wiggles are going to be in a different spot. And that's making this really cool look where they're overlapping but not quite. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this secondary because we're going to be creating secondary strokes. So the first thing that I like to do with this secondary shape selected is go to the Add triangle again. And I'm going to go ahead and click Trim Paths. Now what Trim Paths does is I'm going to go ahead and turn off this main one for now. And if I open Trim Paths, you can see that it's just letting me kind of draw on and off this circle. So I'm going to set this to about 40 and hit enter so that we have a good chunk taken out of it. And I'm going to alt-click the stopwatch to add an expression. I'm going to use wiggle, which is going to let the values kind of randomly change. The first number, I'm going to type 4, which is going to be how many times per second it changes. And I'm going to do a comma, and I'm going to type 40. Close the parentheses and hit enter. Now you can see what that's going to do is it's just going to kind of animate where this starting spot is. So I'm going to copy that expression, and I'm going to paste it onto the end. And now I'm going to also alt-click the offset, and I'm going to paste it, but this time I'm going to change this up to 180 so that it really pushes around. Now you can already see how it's really varying what's happening with this secondary stroke circle. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and turn this main one back on so you can kind of see how that looks. It's already starting to come together, but I want you to be able to really see that second stroke a little better. So I'm going to go to the transform settings inside the secondary shape, and I'm going to add more wiggle expressions to here. So I'm going to alt-click the position, and I'm going to type wiggle, and I'm going to say 4, and I'm going to say about 6. And this is kind of based on what your stroke width here is. So you're going to have to play around with this. You can see what that's going to do is it's just kind of push it around a little bit. If you're having trouble seeing that, I'm going to type 60 just so you can really see what it's doing. It's just really pushing it all over the place. So maybe I'll set it to around 8 to keep it consistent with how the stroke width is so you can at least kind of see it coming off of the other one. And then I'm going to go ahead to the opacity, and I'm first going to set this down to 50. And then I'm going to alt-click and wiggle, and I'm going to say 4, and then I'm going to say 40. And so because we've set the baseline to 50, that means that it's going to be able to wiggle between the values from all the way down at 10 to all the way up at 90. So I'm going to hit enter, and you can see that this effect is almost done. What's really going to pull it all together is typing posterize and we want to grab this posterized time effect here. Now what this does when I drag it on here is it lets me force a frame rate for this layer. So I'm going to set this to 8, which is what I like to use. Basically, it's going to force that to be a frame rate of 8, and you see it gives it this really kind of choppy, hand-drawn look, as if I'm drawing only 8 frames per second, each frame held for 3 frames. You could also, of course, use 12. It's really up to you and the style you're going for, but I like to use 8 to kind of really push it very far. Okay, so that is the basic effect. Now you've seen how to do that. I'm going to show you some really cool ways that you can use this. Now in this composition over here, you see that I have this rubber hose stick figure here. If I press play, he just kind of waves his arms and he's animated. Now you can do the same exact thing here that I showed you with the head, and I'm going to show you something to help speed this up when you have a lot of different layers together. So if I go to the circle, I can open this up, and I want to just grab this wiggle paths that I already made, and if I copy that, I can come here and click on the ellipse and just paste it. And then of course I can duplicate this group, and then inside this group, which is the secondary strokes, what I can do is come back to circle and copy this trim paths, and I can paste it in the head, and so on. I can go into the transform settings. I can go ahead and right click on position and click copy expression only, and then if I paste that on this transform right here, it's going to paste that. Now that might be a little intense for how big the head is here, but I'm just going through this quickly to show you. And of course, you can copy and paste all the other expressions as well. Now, if I were to come down here with this rubber hose rig, and if you don't know, rubber hose is a third-party plugin, so it's not free. It doesn't come with After Effects, but it is a really cool way to rig up these characters. So it works by drawing shape layers, and if you come into this style here and go into base hose, they've just renamed some of these things. You can see this base hose here is what the whole shape is. So this base hose here is where you would add this wiggle paths, and you can see it wiggled that path for us. We could go ahead and do all the rest. Now I'm going to come over here to this composition where I've already done all of that to save some time, and you can see how that looks. He's waving his arm. He's got all these different paths going. We do have a little bit of slowdown just because I'm recording and I am trying to render this out at the same time. But you can see how that looks. It's really fun, cool animation. And instead of applying this posterized time effect to all of the layers in here, I'm just going to create a new adjustment layer. I want to drag this up to the top, and of course I did that with Control-Alt-Y. And if I drag the posterized time to the adjustment layer, I can set it to 8 right here, and that way I only have to do it once. If I want to turn it off, I just turn off the layer, and I can also change it to 12 all at the same time. This can also help because if you put it on every individual layer and you kind of drag these around a little bit, the frame rate can kind of get out of sync, and one thing changes and the other doesn't, and it can look pretty bad. So that's why it's helpful to put an adjustment layer at the top if you're doing this for a bunch of things in the same composition. Okay. Moving on, we have this house here, and as you can see, it's just a house drawing. This is just a shape layer, and this house is made, if I go into the content, you can see that it's just a whole bunch of different shapes drawn here. So what I could do is I could go and I could individually add the effects, the wiggle paths to every single one of these, and I could duplicate them all and add the trim paths and the expressions, but of course that would take a long time. So the easiest way is just to select all of this and hit Control-G, and that will group them all together for you as well. Now this group is where you want to add the wiggle paths, and you can see it wiggles it all together, and then once you have this, you can duplicate this whole group together. This is where you can add your trim paths, and where you can add your expressions to the position, and so on. Now, I should note that by doing it this way, by duplicating the whole group together, you will get a slightly different looking effect. You can see here on the screen now on the left is one where I individually added the effect to every single item in that shape layer. And on the right is where I did the method that I just showed you, where they're all together. You can notice that in the one on the right, the pulsating kind of seems to happen all together, and on the left, it happens more individual. So it's up to you which style you like better. If you like the one on the left better, you just have to decide if it's worth the extra time and effort to do each one individually. But again, that is up to you. So moving on, I want to show you a couple other things that you can do and problems you might run into. So starting with the circle here, if we wanted to go ahead and draw this circle on, you would click Add, and you would do Trim Paths. And instead of adding the expressions like we did before, this would be a separate trim path. So I'm even going to name this Draw to help keep it organized. And you can see I would just do this and draw it on like I showed you before. Now, once I've added that, let's say I want to go ahead and start stylizing this. So I can go ahead and go Wiggle Paths. And I'm going to crank this up a bit just to really show you what's happening. So you can see I've really cranked that up. If I go back here and start going backwards, it kind of crumples, it kind of smushes this drawing together. So it's actually a pretty easy fix if you don't like how it's bunching up like that. All you have to do is check the order of the wiggle paths and the draw. You can just drag the wiggle paths before the draw. And now that that happens before I draw it on, if I do this, it strokes it after it's been wiggled. So something to keep in mind if you're running into that problem. Likewise, I'm going to come to this triangle here. Now, this triangle, if I turn off this roughen edges that I used, you can just see that it's very sharp corners. And anything you use with sharp corners might give you a bit of a problem. Let me show you what I mean. If I come into the contents, I come into this poly star shape, and I add the wiggle paths. Okay. Let's go ahead and change this to smooth like we always do. And you can see immediately it's done this weird bumpy thing on the edges here. So if I go ahead and like crank up the scale, you can really see that doesn't look great. I don't like the way that looks. So the easiest way to fix that is just to go ahead and come to the polystar path. You want to right click where it says polystar path and click. Happened too fast. Okay, right click on that and go convert to Bezier path. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete this wiggle paths just so you can see more clearly what's happening. So it turned it into a path. It's no longer an editable polystar, but if I go ahead and turn on my view, if I press Shift-Control-H, select this layer, and yeah, click this button here to reveal the mask. You can't really see this too well. Let's turn this to a nice bright orange so you can see that. So if I zoom in here and press G on my keyboard, I can just select this. I can hold Alt, which gives me this kind of caret cursor. And if I pull it just a little bit, it's going to round out that edge. You can already see what that did. It rounded out the edge there. And if I go ahead and just round out all three edges like that, if I zoom out now, just rounding them the slightest bit makes it so that I can click Add Wiggle Paths. I'm going to hide my stuff so that you can see this more clearly. And if I go into this Wiggle Paths here and set it to Smooth, you can see we no longer have that problem. So if I play with the detail, if I play with the size, we do not have that problem anymore. Okay, now I'm going to show you how you can use this with text. Now, with text, what you can easily do is right-click this and say, Create Shapes from Text. And now you just have a shape layer here. You could turn this fill off. I like to turn that to nothing. Turn this stroke up. And the cool thing about this is regardless of whether you're going to use the hand-drawn effect that I'm showing you, you can use a trim paths in the contents here. And if I grab a trim paths, then I can just draw these on and off. So that's very fun. And then you can also apply the same wiggle thing that I've showed you before. But the downside to this is you cannot edit this text anymore. So another way that you can do this is I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and turn this one back on. I'm actually going to change this font to something a little bit more thin. I like, let's see, what is it called? Moonflower is a good font that I have. That is nice and thin, and it'll work really well for this. So I can come up here, and I can actually select Turbulent Displace. And it's going to kind of push it all around. But what I can do is just bring this size very low, like 10. And if I zoom in a bit so I can see it better, this amount is too high, so maybe I set that to 20. And if I just kind of mess with this, you can see what it's doing. So that looks pretty good to me. I can alt-click on Evolution and type time times 500. And that's just going to make it automatically animate for us. And then, of course, I come back here and I get my posterized time and drag it on, and I set it to 8. And this will also give you a very nice kind of hand-drawn look. Okay, so now that we've talked about all those different ways that you can use this effect, I'm going to show you, once you've done the animation, how you can stylize it a little bit. So if I come back over here, you can see we have this circle like we made at the beginning. It's animated, it's got this cool look to it. And if I click on circle, the first thing that I'm going to do, I really like using this roughen edges here. So if I drag this roughen edges onto the circle, what it does is it first of all will kind of bleed some of the edges together. So if I turn this off, you see how we have these 2 strokes here. If I turn that back on, it kind of bleeds them together. So it gives it this nice sort of inky look. It's not great if you're going for a pencil look, but for a pen or brush look, this looks very good. You can also see it kind of varies the width, so it looks a lot more organic. And it also kind of animates. So this is getting a little thin in some of these areas, so I might turn this down to about 5. And that way we still get the effect, but it is still showing up very nicely all the way around. And now you can see I've also made this duplicate copy of the circle. So if I turn this on, it's just another stroke. So I'm actually going to fill this with like a nice kind of reddish color, like maybe a sort of orangey, slightly orangey red. And I'm going to turn this stroke off down to 0. And I'm going to rename this color and just drag it behind the circle. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this effect here. And in this ellipse, I'm first going to add a offset paths. Now what this does is it's going to kind of let me push the border in or out. So I can pull it in a little bit by like -5. If I pull this way back, you can see what that's doing. And -5, it'll just help it stay within the lines. And then on top of this, I can add a wiggle paths. Now there's no outline that I'm wiggling, but I'm still wiggling the border of it. So I can come in here. Let's turn this detail down to maybe 3. Of course, we can always play with this later. Smooth, and the scale, let's turn it up to about 30. We'll kind of see how this is pushing in and out. It's giving it a more blobular kind of look, as if it was painted in later. Now, I'm going to go ahead and change the blending mode of this to multiply, and you can already see how I'm seeing the background through it, so that looks very nice. And if I come over to my project settings here, I have this nice animated charcoal texture that I can drag on top and maybe scale it down a little bit so you can see more of that texture. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead to this color, and I'm going to set the track matte to Luma. And you can see how it now has that really nice texture. I can grab a levels and just bring that on top of the charcoal texture and just play with these settings here. Let's see. Let's drag this side up to make it a little bit darker. Drag this side up to make those lights pop a little bit. And this is animated, so it'll change as it goes. That's very nice. I'm also going to set this circle outline to multiply as well, just so we might see a little bit of that background through it. And then the last thing I'm going to do is come to the position property of this. I'm going to actually just kind of drag it a little bit so we get this kind of offset look. And I'm also going to alt-click on position and type in wiggle, and let's do 4,4, just so it moves around a little bit as well. And then, of course, I already have this posterized time effect on here because it was on the circle when I duplicated it. So this is giving us this really, really nice effect. I'm going to pull this back just a little so it's not super off-center. There we go. That looks pretty nice. And when you use this position effect here, I think this actually animates after it does the posterized time. So I'm going to actually cut that position from that expression from the position. That was on the overall transform position, and I'm just going to put it on the transform position of the shape layer. And that way I'm making sure that this posterized time is affecting it. So there you go. That's how you can create this really cool hand-drawn effect inside of After Effects for your motion graphics or animation projects. You can see there's so many different ways to stylize this, so go ahead and play around with it, see what you can come up with. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions for other cool ways to use this effect or make it better, feel free to leave a comment below, and thanks for watching. Bye.